At 34,000 feet, the atmosphere cannot sustain human life. Commercial aircraft maintain a pressurized cabin to compensate for this, regulating airflow so that passengers breathe comfortably even at cruise altitude. It is one of the most fundamental systems in aviation, governed by a single-mode selector on the overhead panel. On the morning of August 14, 2005, that selector was in the wrong position. The pressurization system aboard Helios Airways Flight 522 was set to manual. It had been left that way after a maintenance check the night before. Neither pilot identified the discrepancy before departure as the Boeing 737 climbed out of Larnaca, Cyprus. The cabin altitude climbed with it. The air inside the aircraft grew thinner with every 1,000 feet. Warnings sounded. The crew misidentified them, and by the time the aircraft reached cruise altitude, every person on board, 6 crew members and 115 passengers, had lost consciousness. The autopilot continued to fly. It held heading, altitude, and airspeed with perfect precision. It followed every instruction it had been programmed to execute. The only thing missing was a conscious human being to tell it what to do next. For nearly 2 hours, the aircraft drifted across the eastern Mediterranean, mechanically sound, aerodynamically stable, and entirely beyond saving. Helios Airways was a low-cost Cypriot carrier based in Larnaca, operating a small fleet on routes across the eastern Mediterranean. Flight 522 was a scheduled morning service to Athens, a flight of roughly an hour and 20 minutes. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-31S, registration 5B-DBY, built in 1998. The captain was Hans-Jürgen Merten, a 60-year-old German national. The first officer was Pampos Karalambous, a Cypriot pilot. 4 flight attendants staffed the cabin. 115 passengers filled the seats, among them families and children headed to Athens for holidays, business, and onward connections. The weather was clear. No mechanical discrepancies had been recorded. By every available measure, it was an unremarkable departure on a routine summer morning. The night before, Helios maintenance personnel had performed a pressurization leak check, a standard procedure that involves pressurizing the fuselage on the ground to verify seal integrity. To conduct the check, the pressurization mode selector was set to manual. When the check was completed, the selector was not returned to auto. In the automatic position, the system manages cabin pressure without crew intervention, regulating outflow valves to maintain a cabin altitude of roughly 6,000 to 8,000 feet, regardless of how high the aircraft climbs. In manual, the system does nothing unless the crew actively commands it. The pre-flight checklist required the pilots to verify the position of this selector. That verification either did not occur or did not catch the error. The timeline from this point forward compressed rapidly, and each minute that passed closed off another opportunity for recovery. As the aircraft climbed through approximately 12,000 feet, the cabin altitude warning horn activated. This is a critical alert, but on the Boeing 737, this horn produces a sound identical to the takeoff configuration warning, an alert relevant only on the ground. The crew appear to have interpreted the alarm as a configuration warning, which would have been inexplicable in flight, but was evidently the conclusion they reached. The captain contacted Helios operations by radio. He reported the alarm and noted that equipment cooling lights were illuminated. The ground engineer discussed cooling fan circuit breakers. He did not ask about the pressurization mode selector. He did not inquire about cabin altitude. With each exchange, the crew moved further from the real problem. By approximately 14,000 feet of cabin altitude, cognitive impairment from oxygen deprivation had likely already begun, though neither pilot would have been aware of it. This is where the physiology of hypoxia becomes central to understanding the accident. At cabin altitudes above 10,000 feet, the partial pressure of oxygen drops below what the human brain requires for full function. The effects are gradual and deeply deceptive. There is no pain, no obvious distress signal. Judgment deteriorates. Reaction time slow. The ability to process information erodes progressively. And critically, the affected individual typically has no awareness that anything is wrong. A pilot in the early stages of hypoxia may feel entirely normal, even confident, while their capacity to respond to an emergency is already compromised. The very system failure that required urgent crew action was simultaneously destroying the crew's ability to take that action. At approximately 18,000 feet of cabin altitude, the passenger oxygen masks deployed automatically. Some passengers would have put them on, but these masks are connected to chemical oxygen generators with a limited supply, roughly 12 to 22 minutes. They are designed as a temporary bridge to keep passengers alive while the crew descends to a breathable altitude. They are not a long-term solution. In the cockpit, both pilots had quick-donning oxygen masks within arm's reach, connected to a far more robust supply. Standard procedure for a cabin altitude warning is unambiguous. Don the mask. Begin an emergency descent. These are memory items, drilled into pilots precisely because the situation demands immediate action without time to consult checklists. Neither pilot donned a mask because the crew never recognized the alert as a pressurization emergency. They never associated it with the need for supplemental oxygen. By 25,000 feet of cabin altitude, the window for crew intervention had closed. The cockpit voice recorder captured their communications growing more confused, more fragmented, and then falling silent. The autopilot maintained the programmed route. The aircraft leveled at 34,000 feet and continued toward Athens. In the cabin, the passenger oxygen supply would have been exhausted within roughly 15 to 20 minutes of deployment. At 34,000 feet, without supplemental oxygen, useful consciousness is measured in seconds. One by one, the passengers and remaining cabin crew lost consciousness. The aircraft flew on. At approximately 9:40 in the morning, Greek air traffic controllers expected Flight 522 to begin its descent into Athens. They attempted contact on the assigned frequency. No response. They tried alternate frequencies. They tried the emergency frequency. Silence. Two F-16 fighter jets scrambled from Nia and Helios Air Base. The fighters located the 737 at cruise altitude, flying straight and level. When the F-16 pilots looked into the cockpit, the first officer was slumped motionless in his seat, oxygen mask not donned. The captain's seat appeared unoccupied, or the captain was slumped below the window line. The cabin windows revealed no movement. The fighters rocked their wings. No response. The aircraft had overflown Athens and entered a holding pattern, following its programmed route. It circled, and then, at approximately 11:49, nearly 2 hours after the crew had become incapacitated, one of the F-16 pilots reported movement in the cockpit. A figure appeared in the left seat. This was later identified as Andreas Prodromou, a 25-year-old Helios flight attendant who also held a commercial pilot's license. Though he was not type-rated on the Boeing 737, investigators determined that Prodromou had most likely accessed one of the portable oxygen bottles carried in the cabin for crew use. This limited supply sustained him long enough to reach the cockpit. The flight data recorder registered control inputs from the left seat consistent with someone attempting to manipulate the aircraft. At 12:03 local time, fragmentary evidence suggests he attempted to transmit a mayday call, but the fuel tanks were nearly dry. At 12:04, the left engine flamed out. Minutes later, the right engine followed. With both engines failed, the aircraft entered a powerless descent. Andreas Prodromou, alone in the cockpit of an aircraft he was not trained to fly, had no means to recover. The aircraft struck a hillside near the village of Grammatico, 33 kilometers north of Athens. All 121 people on board were killed. The investigation was conducted by the Hellenic Air Accident Investigation and Aviation Safety Board. Both the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were recovered. The physical evidence confirmed that the aircraft had suffered no structural failure, no explosion, no fire prior to impact, and no mechanical malfunction of any flight-critical system. The engines had operated normally until fuel exhaustion. The pressurization system was functional. It had simply never been engaged. The mode selector was confirmed in the manual position. The cockpit voice recorder captured the cabin altitude warning horn sounding as the aircraft climbed. It captured the confused exchange with Helios operations about equipment cooling. It captured the progressive deterioration of crew communication. And it captured the silence that followed. The flight data recorder corroborated the timeline. Cabin altitude rose continuously from takeoff, crossing 10,000 feet, then 14, then 18, and continuing until it equalized with the aircraft's actual altitude. At no point was an emergency descent initiated. At no point were the crew oxygen masks activated. The investigation also examined the broader operational context. Helios Airways was found to have significant deficiencies in its safety culture, training programs, and crew resource management. The airline's procedures did not adequately prepare crews to recognize pressurization emergencies. The communication between the flight crew and the ground engineer reflected a systemic failure, not merely an individual one. The engineer focused on equipment cooling rather than pressurization because the right questions were never built into the process. The final report identified the probable cause as the crew's failure to recognize that the pressurization mode selector was in manual during pre-flight checks, and their subsequent failure to identify the cabin altitude warning, leading to incapacitation from hypoxia and the eventual loss of the aircraft. Contributing factors included the maintenance crew's failure to restore the selector, the identical oral signature of the cabin altitude and takeoff configuration warnings, inadequate troubleshooting guidance from Helios ground personnel, and systemic deficiencies in training and oversight. Helios Airways ceased operations shortly after the accident. Criminal proceedings were initiated against company officials and the maintenance engineer, establishing precedents in corporate accountability for aviation safety. But the more lasting impact was on the industry itself. The identical warning horn issue on the Boeing 737 received intense scrutiny. A survivable pressurization failure and an irrelevant ground configuration alert producing the same sound was recognized as a design vulnerability that had existed for decades. Boeing and regulators addressed this in later variants and through operational guidance. Training standards were revised worldwide, with new emphasis on the physiology of hypoxia and the absolute priority of mask donning and emergency descent as immediate actions, to be taken before troubleshooting, before diagnosis, before any other consideration. The most unsettling dimension of the Helios disaster is what it reveals about the boundary between automation and human oversight. The autopilot aboard Flight 522 performed flawlessly. It held altitude, maintained heading, followed the route, entered the holding pattern. It executed every task it had been designed to perform for nearly 2 hours, while every human being on board was unconscious or dead. The autopilot does not monitor cabin pressure. It has no awareness of whether the people it is carrying are alive or dead. It does not ask questions. It does not notice that the cabin is depressurizing. It does not wonder why no one is responding to air traffic control. It does not initiate an emergency descent on its own. It waits for a human command. And when that human is no longer capable of commanding, the machine carries on, indifferent and precise, until the fuel runs out. In an era of increasing cockpit automation, Flight 522 stands as a stark illustration of the limits of that architecture. Automation extends human capability. It does not replace human judgment. And when the human element is removed, not by design but by physiological failure, the system has no mechanism to save itself. 121 people lost their lives that morning. Among them were families who boarded expecting to land in Athens an hour later. Among them was a crew that walked onto the aircraft with no indication the day would be anything other than ordinary. And among them was Andreas Prodromou, who fought his way to the cockpit in the final minutes and tried to save them all. His effort, though it could not change the outcome, remains one of the most remarkable acts of individual courage in the history of commercial aviation. Helios Flight 522 did not expose a single catastrophic failure. It exposed a system that allowed ambiguity to survive inside a safety-critical environment. A switch left in the wrong position, a warning that sounded like something else, a checklist that did not catch the error, a ground engineer who asked the wrong questions, a crew whose capacity to recognize the problem was destroyed by the problem itself. Each failure was individually survivable. Together, they were not. In aviation, ambiguity is never harmless.